Thank you to Zyro for sponsoring this video. Create your own website at zyro.com/special/writingongames and use code writingongames to get 30% off your purchase. As much as the films themselves are usually pretty harmless fun, it can sometimes be difficult not to take a more cynical view when examining the broader scope of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as you see the release timelines of endless sequels and spin-offs years away from the separate unreleased sequels they just announced, and you perhaps start to question, do these films exist because they're stories that Marvel felt absolutely needed to be told, or is the Marvel factory just churning out whatever they can squeeze from these franchises that act as vehicles for gauche product placement to get people in the cinema as many times as possible, spending as much money? Perhaps it's good timing then that since cinemas are in something of a precarious position at the moment, you can now get this art as industry experience from the comfort of your own couch, controller in hand. The difference being that instead of product placement and weird corporate tie-ins, we now have obnoxious live service DLC and, well, weird corporate tie-ins. Indeed, the release model of Marvel's Avengers, the exclusives, the microtransactions, have come to define the game's identity in a significant and utterly detrimental way long before its release. Certain characters are platform locked, your access to certain cosmetics and emotes dependent on what gum you decide to stick between your teeth. Given that from the time of the initial reveal, communication as to what Avengers even is has been more than a little vague, it's been hard for many people to see the actual game behind all of this stuff you can buy. Stuff you can't experience unless you buy something else. And there is very much a game here, one that's fairly simple to define at that. After getting my hands on the A-Day set piece that opens the game at last year's Gamescom, I was actually pretty excited about playing the full thing. It seemed big, explosive to a ridiculous degree, a real exercise in Bayhem-esque excess, as you flew, shot, punched and slammed your way through dozens of lowly enemies. This game is a cinematic brawler, and there's a place for that kind of experience. And you know, there's also scope in a game about superheroes to explore further missions beyond a campaign, in the same way you'd get new issues of a comic book, for example. Despite the negative backlash, it seemed like there was a through line here that could have seen Avengers provide a continuous stream of meaningful content to keep players coming back after the main credits rolled. However, as became readily apparent after a few hours with the beta and many hours with the full game, that vision doesn't exactly come to fruition. And the problem is squarely in the execution, laying bare the stark divide between the two separate games awkwardly slammed together that actually comprise Marvel's Avengers. The aforementioned cinematic brawler and the grindy, repetitive, gear score driven live service that acts as the post-game, that were actually akin to a comic book, would see you reading the same issue over and over again, constantly interrupting your reading experience with reminders that you could change the cover if you want. It's abundantly clear that this is the side of the experience the publisher wants you focused on, to the extent that they're more than willing to kneecap the very real potential of the campaign to make that happen. What they perhaps don't realise, however, is that their inability to fully commit to one side of the game's identity or the other leads to the worst possible scenario. A fairly enjoyable experience constantly having to battle the fact that its worst qualities are being highlighted by purchases that serve no purpose. Let me explain. Now, loot games are not exactly my forte. I've never been a huge fan of the idea that my ability to progress through an area or beat an enemy would be so blatantly governed by arbitrary gear scores rather than my own skill. But in those rare systems I have found myself engaging with, at least there's been an element of customization there beyond just which numbers are being foregrounded. Unlocking a cool cosmetic element can be a compelling incentive to perform certain tasks in games, and God knows I've dabbled in enough fashion souls to confirm the truth in that. But Avengers totally fails in that department. See, as you play, you pick up loot seemingly wherever you go. A new piece of armor for Iron Man, a new handle for Mjolnir, some new bones for Hulk, I guess. But none of it will ever appear on your character because, of course, they want you to buy one of the pre-assembled, presumably Marvel-approved, brand-consistent outfits for these heroes. And I don't know, the idea of taking these established characters and personalizing them in your own way, mixing and matching individual items to create your own version of Hulk or Cap, would honestly be reasonable reason enough for me to spend a little bit more time exploring the game's bland environment, actively engaging more with the missions outside of the story, and thinking more deeply about the various stat buffs I might be sacrificing if I choose a particular loadout that I thought looked cooler. Instead, what we have is, sure, a substantial amount of purchasable costumes, but without any customization beyond that, you're paying a frankly absurd amount of money for a totally inflexible uniform that has zero gameplay effects and is crucially completely non-unique. Your friends, who you're constantly being encouraged to connect with, could have already bought this outfit. Further, this kind of ruthless segmentation between the gear you pick up and the outfits you can wear only serves to highlight just how arbitrary the numbers governing this stuff actually are. You're not equipping gear, you're altering a series of digits. And given the care or lack thereof with which some of these costumes have been treated, the game isn't exactly making the best sales pitch to get people on board. It's not dissimilar to a game like Ghost Recon Breakpoint, where the loot system they were so desperate for you to engage with ended up broken because enemies could be taken down with a simple headshot. What I found was that on normal difficulty, despite the sheer number of screens telling me about the different upgrades and modifiers for each individual piece of equipment, the multiple gear vendors throughout the world, and the stupid amount of resources to keep track of, as someone who flatly could not care less about any of this stuff, I never once had to think about any of it beyond simply holding down the button that said equip best gear. I'd trash everything else in my inventory and use the scrap to boost whatever I had equipped. All of this is to say that I don't even think that Avengers should have been a loot game to begin with. The brawler at its core is too simple for all of this, and that's not a bad thing. I actually wish it leaned more into that simplicity. The combat isn't awful, it's uncomplicated, sure, but it can be sufficiently weighty. When the animations don't feel just straight up clunky, or the frame rate isn't chunking horribly, or mission objectives just break, or texture clipping renders platforming extremely awkward and inconsistent, or some QuickTime events just hover forever until you press the button to make the movie go, but then others kill you immediately, or characters just glitch in and out of existence, or the cosmetics cause these horrible uncanny abominations. I mean, seriously, why hasn't Captain America's outfit been fixed yet? Yeah, aside from all that, there's enough differentiation between the heroes, enough options at your disposal while playing each one, to make picking who you're going to inhabit for this particular mission a somewhat meaningful choice. And you know what? Every so often you're presented with a scenario where things just click for just a moment. You time a series of parries and dodges correctly, and suddenly an enemy that could almost obliterate you in one hit is turned into a punching bag you're raining down hell on, juggling them into oblivion, evoking that childlike feeling of smashing action figures together. Like the Samurai Jack game I covered a couple of weeks ago, it finds itself playing into that oddly nostalgic framework of the PS2 or GameCube era superhero game, where you'd largely run rampant, mashing everything in sight. A kind of title I had a lot of fondness for growing up, but with slightly more bells and whistles attached for the modern age. There is a charm to this kind of game, one that might not yield the most prolonged profit margins necessarily, but could certainly appeal to fans looking to simply inhabit their favourite heroes and lay the smackdown through some visually explosive cinematic set pieces for what should have been a 4 to 5 hour story. A story which, I should mention, is a solid enough chunk of popcorn fun as you'd expect from the movies, but as with many of those films, it does have its moments. By framing the story around Miss Marvel as she attempts to reassemble the Avengers after their forceful disbandment years prior, as more of those characters enter the fray, the narrative gradually shifts into an examination of the phrase "don't meet your heroes," except taken to the logical extreme of, well, actual superheroes. These guys aren't exactly happy-go-lucky types. Many of them seem jaded before the game's inciting incident, contrasting hard with Kamala's bright-eyed optimism. But rather than lean entirely on the trope of "your differences are what make you special and you should feel all light and happy about that," the writers instead test that optimism to its very limit on the way there. They really force Kamala to question whether she actually wants to be a part of the situation she's thrown herself into, simultaneously bearing witness to these people she's admired her entire life speak about her as if she's not there, coldly describing her powers as a disease that they inflicted upon her, while she also can't help but find time among all the social tension to have a little freak out when she stumbles stumbles across Cap's shield. And indeed, some of the game's strongest storytelling is kind of environmental, emerging from your ability to simply explore the set dressing of it all, seeing the helicarrier staff and even your menus build back up over time as your quest progresses. Sure, some of the more fandom-focused moments can be unbearably on the nose, and prior to the Avengers assembling, the several hours you're treated to of Kamala just narrating every little thing she does to herself sure make her chirpy attitude rather grating after a while, but there comes a point where all of that falls to the wayside, the more complicated group dynamic takes over, and things start to hit a kind of stride. The problem is that Avengers' second game, the live service part, proceeds to suck the energy from the first, seemingly in an effort to train you for what's ahead, to get you used to the idea of endlessly banging your head against the wall in the same missions you've already done purely for the sake of loot. What should have been a snappy little 4 to 5 hour story becomes over double the length, so padded as it is with filler missions that add nothing to the narrative and worse, aren't even visually interesting. It relegates those fun, explosive set pieces to the role of mere punctuation between the majority of other missions, which see you repeatedly run across the same canyon or city or tundra environment to hack the thing or capture the point or destroy the thing and or point. Missions that, even in single player, fall victim to the necessary quirks of the game's much talked about co-op systems. Expect to be waiting a while to start a mission while your computer-controlled companions pick their loadouts, I suppose? The action can be fun, but the structure that frames it only serves to highlight its most tiresome qualities. And you have to ask yourself, for what? A loot system that doesn't matter? The hope that people will connect with friends and find some reason to buy meaningless emotes or nameplates? This game is in such a weird spot where the microtransactions are so omnipresent, seemingly so baked into the game's DNA, that they literally spoil story beats, and yet the game itself feels strangely ashamed of them. It's as if you can feel the remorse of the devs behind it, being forced to push these purchases in your face at every turn, leaving the resulting experience a sluggishly paced mess, only to make it clear through gameplay that you categorically do not need any of this stuff. There was one moment later on that struck me in this regard, when I was hit with a more abstract fetch quest gate before the final mission that didn't tell me exactly where to go, and I thought, this is where they're going to get me, where they're going to force me to grind through all this side content and they'll push some time saver under my nose and I'll refuse on principle and hate every moment of the resulting hours of gameplay. Why oh why must this stuff always be so gated by arbitrary numbers? I just want to play the game! Until I finished one mission and realised I'd picked up everything I needed. I guess I was glad that the game didn't go in that direction at the last second, but I also kind of hated that I had otherwise been so conditioned to expect it when I just wanted to beat up bad guys and see this neat little story. Because ultimately that's the biggest disappointment about Avengers, that it's become depressingly impossible to separate discussion of the game from the framework under which it was released. Precisely nothing about that decidedly simple, sometimes charming brawler warrants getting any kind of riled up about. As with most Marvel movies, it is the definition of fine. It is exactly the experience I usually have with these films. It hasn't really enriched my life in any way, I'll probably forget about it as soon as I leave the cinema or put the controller down, but I still had some fun. The thing is, I don't usually like talking about microtransactions and DLC and all that stuff because at the end of the day, just don't buy it. That said, this is probably the most acute case I've come across where an ill-thought-out, poorly implemented live service model actively hampers a perfectly serviceable single-player superhero brawler, barging in and becoming the sole focal point of any conversation, keeping a potentially cool little game from ever realising said potential in the process. But speaking of realising potential, let me tell you how you can realise yours by starting your online presence with today's sponsor, Zyro. Zyro is the easiest way for anyone to create a website or online store. There's no hard work or coding skills required. With dozens of designer-made templates that look great and work beautifully, just pick one and start your online presence. I've been looking to get back into building a website as a hub for everything I've got going on, update people on video progress and the like. It's far from ready yet, but as someone whose aesthetic is pretty simple, I don't want to have to mess around with a bunch of code and plugins to make basic changes. Thanks to Zyro's intuitive grid system, I can just drag and drop objects and get them looking exactly how I want in seconds. It's easily the fastest way to build a professional looking website I've used, and if I want to sell merch in the future, that option's there too. Zyro's e-commerce tools allow people to easily manage all their business in one place, including selling on Facebook, Instagram and Amazon. And if you're running into problems, Zyro's friendly support team is available to help 24/7. Zyro is also the most affordable option on the market, never charging you for the features you don't need. And you can get a further 30% off your purchase by heading to zyro.com/special/writingongames and using code writingongames. Doing so really helps the channel to boot. Thank you to Zyro for sponsoring this video, and I hope you enjoyed this piece on Avengers. As always, I'd like to sincerely thank my patrons here. I cannot emphasize enough how crucial your support has been during this time to keeping the channel going. If you feel like you can, and only if you feel like you can really help the continued production of these videos, as well as get things like early access to entirely ad-free video uploads by heading to patreon.com/writingongames and pledging only what you feel comfortable with. I am immensely grateful for your support in whatever form it takes. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Shardfire, Dallas Keen, Dr. Motorcycle, Artyom Vitsyuk, The Nameless Guy, Ham Migas, Hibi Amori, Henry Milek, Lucas, Timothy Jones, Spike Jones, my dad, Bryce Snyder, Anna Pimentel, Rob, William Fielder, Tommy Carver-Chaplin, Leah Chinello, David Björk, Justin's Holderness, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.